Everyone, Lauren Sisler here with AL.com. Week 7 is here, and this is your Week 7 edition of Alabama SEC Insider, brought to you by Keep Alabama Beautiful. Here to break things down. Alabama's lost to Texas A&M, as if you want to hear this regurgitated again and again. Mike Rodak, thanks for hopping on with us. Thanks for being the bearer of bad news, as sometimes we have to do in our roles as journalists, right? As we're talking to Alabama fans. So Alabama loses its first game of the season at the hands of Jimbo Fisher and the Texas A&M Aggies. Final score there, 41-38. Saban, the streak is over against assistants, 24-0. That goes away now, 24-1. Jimbo Fisher breaks the streak, breaks the seal. So just first and foremost, let's start on the defensive side of the football. What's kind of interesting, I will say, Mike, coming off the top of this, I did Nick Saban's radio show on Thursday, and he point blank said, this is a trap game. This team has talent, Texas A&M referring to. They have personnel, just unfortunate injuries and circumstances that led to some of their struggles. And I think that obviously showed up and showed out on Saturday. And we'll start on the defensive side of the football. Just what did you see from this Alabama defense that really struggled, especially a defense that we saw a week ago that handled things against Ole Miss without a problem?
Right. It was a little bit baffling because you take a quarterback in Matt Corral, who's excellent. I mean, a Heisman candidate, and they made him look ordinary. And then you take an ordinary quarterback in Zach Calzada, and they made him look excellent. It's hard to exactly figure out what happens on a week-to-week basis that changed the equation so much. But, I mean, look, I think Texas A&M has really good skill players. I don't think that was in doubt going into the game. I mean, Aniyah Smith, Jalen Weidermeyer, for the tight end, had a big game against them last year. Even the backup running back for A&M, Devon Achane, had a great game as well. We knew they had those guys. It was always just the quarterback was the issue. Even going into the year, there was some question of replacing Kellen Mond with Haynes King, and then King gets hurt, and then that was they lost their linchpin at quarterback. So that was, I think, where some of the doubt about A&M's offense was entering the game. But when you have Calzada play a game like he did, and he might never play a game that good again. It might be like a Steven Garcia moment with South Carolina in 2010 when he beat Alabama. But when you have a quarterback who plays like that, everything else falls into place. You have the skill position players. They had the defense. They had the offensive line. Everything kind of came together. And, that was the best game we might see in a while for A&M's offense. But at the same time, I think Alabama's defense still needs to do better. And it's hard to exactly pinpoint, what exactly is going wrong. I think, it hurts to not have Drew Sanders. It hurts to not have Malachi Moore after that targeting call. But I don't think that was the entire story. I think it's still a case of they can't stop the run. And I think it's understandable to some extent that they couldn't stop the run early in the game because they're in nickel. There's only 2 down defensive linemen. They're not really built like they used to be to have 3 linemen and these big stout linebackers. Like, they're going to probably give up some yards over the middle, but it's those big plays down the field that you expected them to be able to stop with the way this team is built and how they run their defense. And, maybe the personnel is just not quite there compared to what it was last year when it had Patrick Surtain and, Christian Barmore rushing the passer. And it's just something's a little bit off, and it's not obvious. I mean, the stats aren't glaring. They still have one of the better defenses, I think, in the SEC, but it's just not elite. And you're going to have games like this where it just doesn't really work out for them.
Yeah, you give up 41 points to a team that has struggled to put points on the board this season. If you think about it, they had 2 games with only 10 points scored. And one of those games, obviously, essentially what was that? One of those was Colorado, was it Colorado State earlier in the season. And then, of course, just unable to really, put a significant amount of points on the board. So going into this one, just kind of the thought of the struggle and then giving up a touchdown and a field goal in the final 5 minutes of the game, obviously was the dagger, the nail in the coffin for this Alabama football team. All right. So Alabama's offense just doesn't quite have the luster, I guess, and shine that it did a season ago. And a lot of people pointing to, Mac Jones, all the weapons he had around him. You don't have those guys anymore. You don't have your Jalen Waddles. You don't have your Devontae Smiths. You don't have your Najee Harris running the football. So is it a question of the offense per se, or is some of it the coaching with Bill O'Brien calling the plays? what are your thoughts on why this offense is maybe just not as effective and productive as maybe we've seen last year and in the past couple of years?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the play calling aspect of it because I know a lot of people seem to be talking about that today, especially some of those goal line plays. And there's been former Alabama players on Twitter talking about why not run the ball. And you kind of look at the stats. I mean, Alabama's thrown more passing touchdowns in the red zone than any other team in the country this year. They have 13. There's 2 of them in that game. I mean, the screen pass to Jamison Williams and then another one as well. And they're very much capable of scoring the ball throwing in the red zone. And they just didn't do it in that particular case. I know Bryce Young had the interception as well. And at the end of the day, I don't know if the game's any different if they run the ball up the middle. I think, like you mentioned on the radio show, like Nick Saban very much was afraid of that Texas A&M defensive line. He said that's an NFL defensive line. They're all going to be playing in the league before we know it. So, maybe it was a case of just looking at that defensive line, looking at the numbers and thinking it was a better job to pass. I don't really know if the play calling is as big of a deal as it might be made out to be. I think talent certainly an issue, at least relative to what they had last year. Obviously, relative to the rest of college football, they're still a very talented team. But John Mechie has not been a difference maker this year, and that continues to be something that I think is hurting them again relative to what they had last year in Devontae and for the first half with Jalen Waddle before he got hurt. And Jamison Williams making some plays here and there, but just not consistently. I mean, he kind of came on in the second half of that game, and that helped him a lot. But overall, it's just not quite at that level. It's maybe 85% of what it was last year, and they still gained 500 yards in this game, still scored 38 points. But the difference between last year's offense and this year's offense is that when you get a game where you have a high-scoring offense on the other side, in this case, A&M scoring 41, this offense, the Alabama offense, is capable of going up to 45, 50, 55 points like it did against Florida and it did against Ole Miss. And this offense this year just is lacking a little something. And again, it's not glaring. The stats they're still the second highest scoring offense in the SEC, but it's just not quite there enough.
So that kind of gets us to our final question, looking at the big picture, the route to the college football playoff. Alabama dropping to number 5 in the rankings after the loss to Texas A&M. The schedule at Mississippi State this week, then they're home against Tennessee. They get the bye week. Then they host LSU, host New Mexico State, host Arkansas, and then they're at Auburn to close out the regular season. I think it would be easy to say Alabama wins out, plays Georgia in the SEC championship. The win there puts them in the college football playoff. It seems as though that Alabama would be favored in each of its regular season matchups. But, of course, then there's Georgia. So just your overall thoughts on sort of the landscape and the road ahead for Alabama and what you feel that looks like for them and could potentially, go one direction or another.
Yeah, so I'd say the difference between this year and the last time they lost, which was, LSU, their first loss of that year in 2019 was you weren't going to catch LSU. After you lost to them, they were winning the SEC West. They were going to the SEC championship game. Alabama really had to back in if they were going to make the playoff that year. In this case, the SEC West, there has no unbeaten teams remaining. A&M has 2 losses. So even though A&M beat Alabama, they're really not going to win a tiebreaker against Alabama unless Alabama takes another loss. And in that case, I mean, shut it down. It's over. So Alabama's still in the driver's seat. They've already beaten Ole Miss. They have Auburn still on their schedule. They have Mississippi State. They have Arkansas on their schedule. And Arkansas is the only ranked team that they have currently left in their last 6 games. So the SEC West is still theirs to lose, essentially. And then it comes down to that Georgia game. And that's the season. I mean, you can't lose that Georgia game and make the playoff and have 2 losses. And you probably can't lose before that. I mean, there is, I guess, a scenario where they pick up a second loss. They still win the SEC West. They go to the SEC championship game. And if they win it, then you have a weird situation where you have a 2-loss SEC winner, and the playoff committee has to consider that. But that's extreme. I think really the scenario right now is you either run the table and you beat Georgia or you don't and you're out of the playoff. And it's kind of simple, I would say, at this point.
Yeah, pretty clear cut there. And, I think, too, even if they would have beat Texas A&M, I don't think there was still a clear, path to the college football playoff necessarily. Again, so I don't know that they're in a much different position than they would have been, but certainly a little bit more on the outside looking in than had they have won the game this weekend. So certainly some good insight there. But the season rolls on. We're week 7, got to keep moving forward. As I said, this weekend, Mississippi State, that's where they'll be headed, to the good old land of the cowbell. So go ahead and get your earplugs ready, Mike. I know you're going to be heading that way, making the drive over later this weekend. So again, thank you for your insight. Thank you for giving us all the intel, and thank you to our sponsors. Keep Alabama beautiful. Appreciate you, and appreciate all our viewers for watching. Peace out. See you next week.